everyone. Today we're going to be making some garden labels using TinkerCAD, a free 3D modeling software that you can get online by visiting tinkercad.com. These are the labels we'll be making today. I'm going to show you how to make them step by step. So basically the steps involved will be to make this sort of ring-shaped object around the word of the plant that we're designing. And then we're going to add the word inside of the ring, and then we're going to add these spikes at the bottom. So to get started, we're first going to be making this kind of ring shape here, which consists of two curved end pieces connected by two kind of like rod shapes. So I'm going to walk you through step by step on how to make these, and when we're done, I will show you two more very basic garden label designs that you can make too if this was a little too advanced for you. But feel free to pause this video and go at your own pace, but I'm just going to be going step by step on my process for making this. Okay, so I'm going to clear my workspace to get started. All right, so we're going to start by going under basic shapes on the right hand side, and we're going to scroll down and find the tube shape and drag it out into the work plane. Now I'm going to make this a little bit bigger by clicking one of the white boxes in the corners. And if I hold down the Shift key, it will keep the same dimensions. So it'll keep it a circle still. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Let's say I'm going to make it 35 by 35. All right, and I want to make the wall, that's how thick the circle is, a little bit thicker. So I'm going to go to wall thickness on the right here, and I'll set that to, let's try 4, see what that looks like. All right, that's a little too thick. Let's move it down to 3.5. All right, that looks pretty good. Maybe 3. All right, perfect. Now, the side slider will be how smooth the ring is. So if I zoom in, you can see that there's all these little, the circle is composed of a bunch of different flat shapes. If I increase the sides, you can see my circle gets a little smoother. So I'm gonna increase that to 50 sides so it looks a little bit smoother. Perfect. Now I want to set the height of my label to be a little bit smaller so it prints, it won't be so bulky. So if I click on this one, I can find out the height by clicking this middle dot that's in the white dot that is in the center of the object. If I click that, I can see this one's about 7.26 millimeters high. So I'll make it a nice even 6 millimeters high. So I'm going to go to my orange object, click that center dot, and I'm going to change that to 6. Now, perfect, 6 millimeters. All right. So I'm going to take this one tube object and I'm going to slice it in half. And that way I will have my two corners here and here, and I'll know that they are the same dimensions because I'm taking them from the same circle object. So how do I do that? Well, we're going to use a hole to cut this perfectly in half. So I'll click this again, and you know the dimensions because I showed them before, but if you forget, you can highlight over the corners and it'll tell you the exact dimensions. So I set it to 35 by 35, but I'm going to make it an even number so it'll be a little bit easier to cut it in half. So I'm going to click the corner. Let's make it 36 by 36. So I'll do 36. I'm just going to use the tab key to go to the other side. 36, hit enter. All right, perfect. So if I want to cut this in half, I'm going to need to make a hole that is half of 36 wide, so 18 wide. So I'm going to drag just a regular box icon from the basic shapes here on the right, and I'm going to set it to 18 millimeters in width. Perfect. And the height shouldn't really matter as long as it's taller than this circle. So you can eyeball it, it doesn't matter. Okay, so now what I need to do, because the width is half of the circle, I need to align them so the side of the hole is lined up with the side of the circle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both the circle and the hole. So you can click one, hold shift and click a second to select them both, or you can just drag a box around them both to select them. And I'm going to click the align tool that's on the top right. You can also access the align tool by hitting the L key. But if you don't want to do that, it's right up on the top right. It looks like two boxes with a vertical line. So I'm going to click that, and all my little dots change to these black circles. So it's asking me how I want them aligned. I'm going to click this circle here at the bottom right, and that's going to align them on this right side of their objects. All right, so now you can see just with the naked eye that this looks like it's been cut right in half. And we know it's been cut in half because this box is half the width of the circle. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to group the hole with the solid object to cut it in half. So again, I'm going to select them both, and I'm going to click group on the top right. And when I group a hole with a solid, it cuts the hole out of the solid. So now we have a semicircle right here. Perfect, so that's one end. Now, instead of going through all of that again, I'm just going to take this and copy it. So I'm going to click the object. I'm going to do Command C and Command V, or Control C, Control V if you're using a PC to copy and paste. If you don't want to use those shortcuts, you can use the icons on the top left, which do the same thing. So I'm going to select my object. The two stacked boxes are copy, and the clipboard is paste. Does the same thing. Now I just need to rotate this. So you can see that there's a few arrow icons. Just make sure you're clicking the right one so you're rotating it on the right axis. I'm going to click this one, and you can either click it, whoops, and rotate it like that, or you can do it the same way we did it before. We can enter it manually, enter 180 degrees to flip it around. All right, so now that we've created our two round edges, we're going to create the top and the bottom little struts that will connect the two curved endpoints. So we're going to do that by dragging out a box, and we're going to make sure we set the box's height to the same as the ends, which again, if you don't remember, you can click that little box in the middle, and we set ours earlier to 6 millimeters. So we're going to change this to 6. Now, we don't know what the thickness of the endpoint is here. It won't be the same as the wall thickness that we set earlier. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to eyeball it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select an end and the box, and I'm going to align them. So click again the L key or the align tool on the top right. I'm going to make sure that they're perfectly flush. So I'm going to align them. And now I'm going to zoom in as close as I can, and I'm just going to have to eyeball it and get it as close as I can. So if I bring in the corner here, that looks pretty good. Now, if you're not getting as much control as I am, it's probably because your snap grid at the bottom might be set to 1 millimeter or more. So the snap grid determines the increments with which you can change object sizes. So you can see here it's kind of like snapping to these fixed points. So that's the snap. It's snapping for 1 millimeter right now. So if I change the snap to lower or just turn it off entirely, now I have, you can see it's much more fluid motion. So I have more control over the size of the object. So I'm going to turn snap grid off. And I'm going to just get an approximation. And you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard to move an object around as well. So I'm just going to tap down with my arrow key until they're just touching. And I can tell that that is pretty good. So I'm happy with the way that looks. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit more. So that looks good to me. Okay, so now that we have that in place, I'm just going to make it a little bit wider. Let's see, that looks pretty good. And we can adjust that later on. I'll show you how to do that. But this looks pretty good for now. So I'm going to make sure that all three of these pieces are aligned. So I'm going to select all three of them. I'm going to click the Align tool again, and I'm going to align them on this edge. So that just moved this piece here to be lined up with the other two. So now I know everything's going to be flush on this side, which is perfect. But before I group them, I'm going to make a copy of this red piece, and I'm just going to put it aside for now. But now I'm going to group these three pieces. So I'm going to draw a box around those three, click group, and now they are all one piece. So now I can just sit this right in there. So I'm going to group everything again. I'm going to align it. This time I'm going to align it on this side. And now we can see our red piece is now flush with our oval. Now I'm going to group everything. Perfect. There we go. Now we have the little border for our label. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to drag the text shape out. So text you can find under basic shapes. Again, it says text. Just drag it out. Flip around so you can read it. So in order to change this text, you're going to go under the shape options on the right. And I'll make it a different color so we can tell that we're working with a different shape. Okay, and now under text, you can change what's written here to change the text that's on your screen. So I'm going to write, we'll do basil again. And it's case sensitive. So I think capitals looks better. So I'm going to keep it at capitals. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind, when we send this to the 3D printer, the printer only has so much detail. So if you do a serif font, and a serif font is one that has these little lips and edges and curves and things at the ends, like these little flare on the letters, the 3D printer might not pick up all that detail when it goes to print. So what I'm going to do is change the font to either a sans or the sans mono font. And basically what that's going to do is just simplify the letters, and it'll make it clearer when we go to print. All right, so before we add this text to our label, we're going to do two things. One, we're going to make a copy of this kind of dog tag looking oval shape and just put it aside, and I'll explain why in a second. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that this basil text fits inside of this and is the same height. So again, the height of this label right here is 6 millimeters. So I'm going to set the basil to be 6, same way I do for the other objects. Now you can see it's a little overlapped now. That's okay. So we can either make basil larger, or we can adjust the size of the oval. So I'm going to adjust the oval. So again, when we go to print, we need to consider what this object is going to look like when it's printed. Now we want the letters to be touching the oval object so they're not floating in space. Because when we go to print, if the letters are not connected to this oval on the outside, they're going to fall right off of the object when we print. So we want to make sure that the letters of basil are touching the top and the bottom of this oval shape. So this is going to be different depending on which word you write in your label. But basically, you're just going to want to get this to look the way you like it. So I'm going to just play around with basil, move the letters a little closer. I think that looks pretty good. And then once I have that in place, I can adjust my label here. And again, you want to make sure that the letters are touching the oval on both the top and the bottom, or at least the top or the bottom, if not both. And you can tell by, you can zoom in, and if you see a little bit of overlap there, that means they're connected. This is a better angle right here. So if you see that right there where the S is overlapping, that you know when you go to print, it will print as one object. Do it a little bit more just to make sure that they're connected. All right, perfect. All right, so if that looks good. That's the way I want it printed. What I'm going to do is, again, select them both. So I can draw a box around them, and I will click Group on the top right. So there we go. We have our basil label finished. Now, the reason I made this duplicate of the oval is because now I can use this duplicate to make more labels without having to go through all the steps of rebuilding this little border. So what I mean by that is I have my border here. I can just drag out the text again, change that text to something else. And now I can use that to make a new label. Now again, before I group these together, I want to make another copy of that label and put it aside so I can do this again and again and again without having to go through all the steps of building that border again. So again, I just take my text, set it to the same height as the oval, kind of position everything the way I like it. It might be helpful to use the arrow keys when you're doing this. Just make sure everything is overlapping. All right, that looks pretty good. So I'm just going to select everything, hit Group, and there we go. Now it is all one object. And I can send that to the printer and it'll all print as one nice piece. Now, once you have it all grouped together as one piece, you can adjust the height at that point too. So if you get to this point and you think it's a little thick or too thin, you can adjust the height that way as well. So I can set this to 3 millimeters if I like it like that too. Okay. Now we just have to add our little spike so it'll stick in the ground. You can do that a bunch of different ways. On these examples I started with, all I did was I used the roof basic shape, which is the green roof shape on the right hand side under basic shapes, and I rotated it forward, shrunk it down a little bit, and just stretched it way out, made it thin, and that's basically it. Now you'll notice that this spike is underneath the work plane. When I go to print, it's not going to print anything under the work plane. So I want to make sure, and it might actually confuse the 3D printer. So we want to make sure everything is flush with the work plane. And you can do that by raising and lowering the object with this black arrow that's right above the dot that tells you how tall something is. You can raise it and lower it with that black cone. So as I'm clicking it and dragging it to raise it and lower it, this number here indicates how high or beneath the work plane it is. If you see a negative number here, that means it's underneath the work plane. So I want to make sure this is 0. So that means it's totally flush with the bottom here. Now this caret label I just made, the height was 3 millimeters. So I'm going to make my spike 3 millimeters. And I'll make it a little bit thinner. Perfect. Now I can just line it up however I like. Make a copy of it. Put one on that side. And you got to make sure to group everything together again. So I'm going to draw a box around everything, click Group, and there we go. That's one label done. Now I made 2 stakes, and that's just a personal preference. You can do the same thing with one, and you don't have to use the roof shape either. You can do just a straight line if that's easier for you. Or you can do a cylinder. You can do basically anything. As long as it's thin, it will stick in the earth. So I'll do it with a box this time. I'll make it a different color so we can tell what we're doing. So all I'm going to do is just make it really, really thin, really, really long. And I need to make sure the height matches the label. So I'm going to set it. This one is 6 millimeters high. So I'm going to make this 6 millimeters high. And if I'm only going to use one spike, I want to make sure it's in the center. So I'm going to put it right there. Drag a box around it, click Group, and there we go. So those are 2 different ways you can make the stakes of your labels. And you can make the stakes as long as you want to. These are pretty short. So just whatever you're adjusting the height, just make sure your spike is the length you want it before you attach it. Otherwise, when you go to make it longer or shorter, it's going to stretch out the words too. Okay. So that is basically all you need to know to make the labels that I showed you in the beginning of the class. Now I'm going to show you a much simpler way of making a label if all of this was too much for you or you're just starting out. So I'm going to clear my workspace, just move everything aside, and we're going to start over. All right, so now this time I'm going to start with my text. And again, I'm going to change it to the sans, and we'll call this one eggplant. Okay, so two different ways you can do this. You can have the words vertical or horizontal. So the first one I'll show you is vertical. So I'm going to drag a box out. I'm going to basically underscore eggplant here. So I'm going to make a really thin and long box, just like I did for the steak. And I'm going to make sure, let me change the color so you can tell what we're working with. I want it to be overlapping. So again, the reason we want it overlapping is so it connects all of these objects. Otherwise, they're going to print and be floating in space. We want everything to be one solid object when we print. So let's make this a little thinner. Okay. So the reason I'm making this line is, again, to connect all of the letters, but also we need something to use as a platform to stick into the ground. So I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. So I'm going to set this to the same height as eggplant, which in this case is 10 millimeters. So change this to 10. Perfect. I'm going to draw a box around everything and click group. Perfect. And now, instead of having this oval shape around eggplant, now it just says eggplant with a platform underneath it. And now I can add my little spike underneath it. Set that to 10 millimeters as well. And if you want to make sure that it's perfectly centered with eggplant, just select a box around both and then click the align tool and just align by the center dot. And that will perfectly align everything. Now I can group it. And there we go. So that's a much easier way of making your label, your garden label. I don't think it looks quite as fancy as the one we used before, but it's totally functional and works great, and it'll take much less time to print as well. And then once we have everything grouped, again, you can adjust all the sizes at this point. So if you want it nice, thin and long and narrow, that works too, like that. All right, I'm going to show you one other quick garden label. It's going to be similar to this one, but in this case, the letters are going to be vertical. So I'm going to start this time again with the text, and I'm going to change it to sans. Now this time I'm going to rotate the text. So I'm going to select the text, click the arrow, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. And I'm going to shrink it a little bit just so we have enough workspace. Okay. Now I'm just going to connect the word pumpkin right with the steak and eliminate that underscore. So I'll do that with the box again because it's a little bit easier. So again, I'm just going to make a really thin, really long rectangle. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see better. Now I need to make it the same height as pumpkin. So pumpkin now is 5.74. So I'm going to make this 5.74 millimeters high. Now I want to align them so this spike aligns with the top of the P and the bottom of all of the letters. So I'm going to draw a box around both of them, click the Align tool. Now I want them to align to the left of the P, right? So I'm going to click this one. Perfect. And now I'm going to use the arrow keys to just nudge this line, this red line, up until it's touching all of the letters. So I'm just going to keep hitting my arrow key until it's overlapping all of the letters. That looks good, but I'll do one more just to be safe. Perfect. If I zoom in a little bit more, you should see that red line is overlapping all of the letters. Now I'm going to draw a box around both of them again and group them together. And there we go. So now I have a vertical garden label. It's just as functional as any of the other ones we made, but I did it in 3 steps instead of making this oval shape. So, and again, because it has less objects in its design, it will print faster, and therefore it'll save you money when you go to print. So that's another consideration as well. So these are 3 designs that you can use to print your own garden labels. Again, you can print through Savo Library by going to savolibrary.org. And under the Library Services tab, go to 3D Printing. That is it for this class. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, you can email me. My email is alex@savolibrary.org. Have a good day.